Kneeling in the snow, he pressed his hand against the bleeding dog's chest. "Stay with me, buddy." The old Marine whispered. He couldn't lose another soul tonight. That night's rescue under a flickering gas station light would uncover a buried secret. A lost K9, a town's betrayal, and one man's fight for truth. Through pain and faith, Walter and his loyal partner found something war had taken, hope. And from that hope, Valor's Haven was born. If this story moved you, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. Snow fell over Duluth like a slow-moving tide of glass and silence, swallowing every streetlight in a veil of white. The night air smelled of iron and lake water, the frozen breath of Lake Superior pushing against the city's tired lungs. Walter Hayes drove his battered Ford pickup through the storm, the wipers scraping ice off the windshield in rhythm with the heavy thud of his heart. He was 65, a retired Marine with shoulders broad as oak trunks and a face carved by both weather and war. His gray beard was trimmed close, though a few rebellious strands curled along his jaw, giving him the look of a man who had stopped caring about appearances but still respected order. His eyes were the color of worn brass, dull but steady, and when he exhaled, the fog of his breath filled the cab like a ghost of all the winters he had survived. Walter wasn't out driving for pleasure. He had never done anything for pleasure since his wife, Martha, passed away 3 winters ago. The silence of his cabin near the shore had become unbearable, so he often drove the night roads just to hear the hum of the tires and pretend it was conversation. The world outside was a blur of white, until a flicker of yellow caught his attention near the curve of the highway. A gas station, its old sign sputtering with weak neon letters, half buried in snow. He slowed the truck, instincts older than reason, whispering that something wasn't right. The Marines had taught him to listen to the unease that rose in his bones like static before a storm. He turned into the lot, headlights cutting through the veil of snow, revealing a sight that turned his blood cold. Under the sign's erratic glow stood a man, unkempt, swaying, his shadow stretching long over the snow. He was pouring gasoline from a red can onto something moving at his feet. A dog, a German shepherd, trembling violently, its fur matted with frost and dirt, its eyes wide with terror. Walter's hand reached for the door handle before thought could intervene. The moment his boots hit the ground, the wind sliced through his coat, but his voice was firm, deep, unshaken. "Put the can down." The man turned, his face raw and red, stubble crawling up to his cheekbones. His eyes gleamed the way cheap whiskey does before the bottle hits the floor. This was Roy Hargrove, a local drunk Walter had seen once or twice at the harbor bar. Mid-40s, rail-thin under his flannel jacket, hands always shaking as if guilt itself lived beneath his skin. Years of bad jobs and worse decisions clung to him like the stink of oil. "Mind your damn business, old man," Roy slurred, lifting the can again. Walter took another step forward, his silhouette filling the light. Even in his heavy coat, the square lines of his body spoke of decades of discipline. His calmness wasn't mercy. It was control honed through battlefields far away from this frozen town. "I said, put it down." Roy's sneer faltered. There was something about Walter's tone, the kind of quiet that came from a man who had once commanded others to kill, that pulled the fight right out of him. The gas can slipped from his hand, hitting the snow with a muted splash. Walter moved closer, eyes locked on the dog. The animal's body shivered violently, its fur glistening with gasoline. Its ribs were visible beneath the thin coat, the black and tan coloring dulled by grime. The dog lifted its head weakly, and for a moment Walter saw not a stray, but a soldier. One who had fought too long and been left behind. He crouched, voice softening. "Easy now. You're all right, buddy." Roy muttered something incoherent, his words dissolving in the wind. Walter ignored him. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around the dog, the smell of gasoline sharp enough to sting his eyes. When his hand brushed against the animal's neck, he felt something rough, a raised mark beneath the fur. He lifted his flashlight. There, beneath a burned patch of skin, faint letters were visible. K9E21. The world seemed to stop. His chest tightened as memories he'd locked away came rushing back. The sound of gunfire, the smell of cordite, the bark of command dogs in combat zones. He knew those markings. They were identifiers from law enforcement or military K9 units. Whoever this animal was, he had once belonged to someone, trained, trusted, and lost. Roy kicked the snow and spat. "That thing's cursed. Killed 2 others up near the ridge. I'm just putting it out of its misery." Walter's eyes hardened, years of discipline flaring in an instant. "You don't get to decide mercy." He grabbed Roy's wrist before the man could reach into his pocket. The faint glint of a lighter flashed, but Walter's reflexes were faster. One twist, one shove, the same moves drilled into him 40 years ago. And Roy was in the snow, the lighter skittering away. Walter's breath came in sharp bursts, the air white around him. The dog whimpered once, drawing him back to the moment. He knelt again, tucking the coat tighter. "Stay with me, pal." The shepherd's eyes, amber, deep, and wounded, met his. There was recognition there, or something like it, as if it could sense the old soldier beneath the layers of age. Walter lifted the dog gently, surprised at how light it was. Under the coat, he could feel every rib, every tremor. He carried it toward his truck, boots sinking into snow that whispered under his weight. The wind howled across the open lot, and the neon sign flickered once before going dark entirely. Inside the truck, warmth began to fill the cab as he turned up the heater. He placed the dog carefully on the passenger seat, the wool coat steaming slightly from the heat. The animal's breathing was shallow, but steady. Walter reached over, brushing a hand against its head. "You're not dying out here. Not tonight." For the first time in months, the emptiness in his chest shifted. Just a little. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was something alive. He started the engine, tires crunching through the snow. Behind him, Roy lay half-conscious in the drift, muttering curses swallowed by the wind. Walter called the local sheriff on his radio, his voice clipped and precise, reporting an attempted animal cruelty case. Then he turned the truck toward town, headlights slicing through the storm. As he drove, the rhythmic thump of the wipers seemed to echo his pulse. He caught himself glancing at the shepherd beside him. The name Valor came to mind, but he shook it off. "Duke," he murmured instead. "That'll do for now." The dog's ears twitched slightly, and Walter allowed himself a rare smile. The storm raged on, snow spiraling like ghosts of old battles past, but inside the cab, there was a small island of warmth. For the first time since Martha's passing, Walter Hayes wasn't running from the dark. He was driving toward something worth saving. The storm had only grown worse by the time Walter pulled into the parking lot of North Point Veterinary Clinic. The wind howled against the windshield, pushing swirls of snow that danced like pale ghosts across the dimly lit sign. He shut off the engine, listening to its ticking fade into the hollow silence before gathering Duke into his arms. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow but steady, the rise and fall of his chest fragile as the flicker of a dying ember. Walter's knees ached from the cold, but he carried the dog as if the weight were sacred, not heavy. Inside, the clinic was a sharp contrast to the raging world outside. Warm, fluorescent, smelling faintly of antiseptic and chamomile. A single light burned behind the frosted glass door marked emergency. When it swung open, a woman appeared, her presence calm yet firm like a flame shielded from the wind. Dr. Nora Monroe was 34, tall, with the graceful poise of someone accustomed to crisis. Her chestnut hair was tied into a loose bun that escaped in soft curls around her temples. Beneath her gray scrubs, her movements were deliberate, efficient, yet not without compassion. Her face was pale from long hours, but her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, were alert and kind, the sort of eyes that could make even the dying hold on a little longer. "Troy nai ai kon lang thang?" she asked with a soft smile, though her voice carried a hint of concern. "Lin gyava cho trang tan," Walter replied, his breath still visible in the cold air. "Bring him here," she said quickly, leading him toward the steel examination table. Her tone was brisk now, professional, but her glance softened when she saw Duke's condition. "Gasoline burns, dehydration, hypothermia," she murmured under her breath, sliding on a pair of latex gloves. "He's lucky you found him when you did." Walter stood nearby, hands clasped, his thick fingers trembling slightly. He hated this helplessness, the same helplessness he'd felt watching men fall in combat, unable to save them all. Duke's fur hissed faintly as Nora began cutting away the singed patches, cleaning the wounds with warm saline. The shepherd flinched, but didn't bite. His discipline was almost human. "A soldier," Nora whispered, more to herself than to anyone. "Yeah," Walter said quietly. "One who's seen too much." Nora looked at him then, truly looked. The man before her wasn't just another old veteran. His eyes carried the weight of too many winters, too many ghosts. His forearms were still roped with muscle, the skin rough like old bark, but it was his stillness that spoke louder, the calm of someone who'd learned to bury storms inside. While she worked, Walter noticed a small framed photograph on the counter, a younger Nora in a Marine Corps uniform, smiling beside a Labrador retriever in a desert setting. "You served," he said. She paused, then nodded without looking up. "I was a medic attached to a K-9 unit in Kabul. That's Scout." Her voice caught slightly. "IED took him out during a search operation. After that, I switched to veterinary medicine. Figured I could still serve, just in a quieter way." Walter's throat tightened. "Guess we both learned the same thing. That quiet doesn't always mean peace." She gave a faint smile. "No, it doesn't." The room filled with the soft hum of the heater and the rhythmic clink of surgical instruments. Then, as Nora reached for a metal sterilizer and clicked her lighter to heat the tip, Duke reacted. His whole body stiffened, eyes wide, ears pinned back. A guttural whine tore from his throat as he jerked against Walter's arm. "Whoa, easy," Walter said, wrapping both arms around the trembling shepherd. He pressed his forehead against Duke's, their breath mingling. "Het bom lua roy, ban oi, you're safe." The words, simple and quiet, seemed to reach through the panic. Duke's trembling eased. Nora froze mid-motion, guilt washing over her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Reflexes from trauma. It's more than just burns." Walter nodded, his jaw tight. "I've seen that look before. Men flinching at thunder long after the war's over." Nora gently touched the scar near Duke's ear. There's something else, she said, pulling a magnifier close. Beneath the burned fur, faded black letters emerged. K9E21. Walter exhaled sharply, the air leaving him like a punch. That's a service mark, he said. Nora tapped a few keys on her computer, connecting to the National Canine Registry. After a few tense seconds, a result appeared. K9 Valor, Seattle PD Tactical Response Division. Status: missing, presumed dead. She turned the screen toward him. If this is him, someone wanted it to look like he never existed. Walter stared at the screen, the fluorescent light reflecting in his eyes. In war, truth gets buried under metals and snow, he muttered. But snow always melts. Nora studied him quietly. You've lost someone, haven't you? He met her gaze. Several, but one stays. My old partner, Lieutenant Briggs. We were ambushed near Fallujah. He told me to take cover. I did. He didn't. Walter's voice was steady, but his hands clenched unconsciously. I stopped believing in second chances after that. Maybe this is one, Nora said softly, glancing at Duke. Maybe fate decided to remind you what loyalty looks like. Walter's laugh was low and rough. I thought fate retired with me. Nora chuckled gently. Fate doesn't do paperwork. For the first time, the tension eased between them. Duke lifted his head weakly, eyes flicking from one to the other, sensing the calm returning. Nora filled out a form, handwriting neat and efficient. He'll need a name for the file, she said. Walter thought for a moment, then grinned faintly. Duke. But if he ever asks for a promotion, we'll add Sir in front. Duke let out a quiet sound that might have been approval. Nora laughed, the kind of laugh that made the sterile room feel warmer. Well, Sir Duke, welcome back to the land of the living. Walter helped move the shepherd to a padded cot in the corner. He knelt beside him, brushing a hand along the dog's side. You've got fight left in you, he said quietly. And I've got time. Guess that makes us a good pair. Nora poured herself coffee and handed him a cup. There's a cot in the back if you want to rest. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. He shook his head. I'll stay here. Someone's got to watch over the soldier. The clock ticked softly. Snow hammered the windows, but inside, the clinic felt like a pocket of peace. 2 veterans and 1 wounded warrior sharing the same fragile silence. By dawn, the storm had eased. Duke was asleep, breathing steady, the worst of the tremors gone. Walter sat slumped in a chair, his coat draped over his shoulders, the glow of the lamp outlining the deep lines of his face. Nora watched him from the doorway, her expression unreadable but full of quiet respect. She whispered, You saved him, Walter. He didn't open his eyes, only murmured, Maybe he saved me first. Outside, the first light touched the frozen streets of Duluth, and for a moment, the world looked clean again. Morning came reluctantly to Duluth, the sun peeking weakly through sheets of frost on the clinic's windows. Walter Hayes stood by the counter with 2 steaming cups of coffee, one for himself and one for Dr. Nora Monroe, who looked as though she hadn't slept. The night had left lines beneath her eyes, though they did little to dull the quiet strength in her face. Duke slept nearby on a blanket, his breathing slow but even, the faint scent of antiseptic still hanging in the air. The storm outside had thinned to a brittle calm, and for a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. Walter's visit to the police station later that morning was meant to be routine, just paperwork for the cruelty case. But routine had never lasted long in his life. The station was small, the kind of building where the walls smelled of burnt coffee and dust, and the sound of an old radio played softly in the background. Behind the front desk sat a woman named Margaret Maggie Quinn, mid-50s, sturdy, with short gray hair and eyes that saw more than she ever commented on. She'd worked dispatch for 20 years, and though her uniform hung a little loose, her posture still carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen the town's worst nights and kept coming back. "Morning, Walt," she greeted, handing him a clipboard. "Didn't expect to see you this early." "Couldn't sleep," Walter said. He signed his name with slow precision. "Thought I'd check the file on that drunk, Roy Hargrove. Something about him doesn't sit right." Maggie frowned. "You and half the town. We've had complaints for years, dog traps, illegal sales to training camps up north. But everything ends the same. Not enough evidence." She tapped the folder before sliding it across the counter. The papers were worn, edges yellowed. Chief Clark signed off on everyone. Raymond Clark, the town's police chief, was a man Walter had met only once. A tall, broad-shouldered officer in his early 60s, with slicked-back silver hair and a handshake that tried too hard. Clark had that polished calm that some men used to hide secrets. His record was spotless, but Walter's gut, sharpened by decades of survival, told him spotless records usually meant something had been cleaned too well. Walter flipped through the pages. Every report followed the same pattern: witness accounts, photos of injured strays, statements that went nowhere. Each one ended in the same neat blue signature. He felt something twist in his chest. Not anger exactly, but a tired kind of disgust. All this, and nothing? "Nothing anyone could make stick," Maggie said. "Some things in this town just get buried, Walt, especially in winter." He nodded faintly, pocketing a few photocopies before stepping back out into the cold. By afternoon, the snow had stopped, leaving behind a white, silent world. Walter returned to the clinic where Nora was tending to Duke. The dog was alert now, his coat cleaned, patches shaved for treatment. He was stronger, too strong perhaps, for an animal that had nearly died. When Walter entered, Duke's ears perked up, tail thumping once against the floor. "Looks like someone's ready to get out of here," Nora said with a smile. Walter knelt beside the dog, his calloused hand resting gently on Duke's neck. "Ain't we all?" Just then, the door swung open and a gust of cold air swept in. A boy stood there, bundled in a red jacket too big for him, freckles scattered across his nose like dust. "Mr. Hayes," he called. "Mom said you were here." It was Ben Carter, a 10-year-old who lived down the street from Walter's cabin. Ben was all energy, wild hair, skinned knees, and a voice that never quite stayed inside. His mother, a nurse who worked night shifts, often relied on Walter to watch him when the snow kept her at the hospital. Ben adored dogs, and the sight of Duke made his eyes widen. "Whoa," he breathed, stepping closer. "That's a real police dog, isn't it?" "Was," Walter said, smiling faintly. "Now he's just trying to remember who he is." Nora chuckled. "Aren't we all?" Ben crouched near Duke, holding out a hand. The shepherd sniffed it once, then gave a slow wag of his tail. "He likes you," Walter said. The boy grinned. "Dogs always know who's good, Mom says." Walter hesitated, then glanced at Nora. "Maybe we should test that theory. There's a spot I want to check up near Silver Bluff. Hargrove mentioned something about the ridge before I turned him in. If Duke can still track, maybe he'll show us what he meant." Nora looked uncertain. "You think he remembers?" Walter met her gaze. "Dogs remember more than we deserve them to." They packed up before dusk, Walter driving, Nora beside him, and Ben in the back seat with Duke resting his head on the boy's lap. The truck crawled through winding forest roads until the trees thinned, revealing a hill dusted in silver light. Silver Bluff wasn't on any map. It was an old hunting ground long abandoned after a series of accidents years back. The place had the eerie stillness of somewhere that didn't want visitors. They stepped out into knee-deep snow. The temperature had dropped again, their breaths forming pale clouds. Duke sniffed the air, his ears twitching. Then, without hesitation, he began to move, pawing through drifts of snow that swallowed his legs. "Looks like he's got something," Walter murmured, following with careful steps. Ben trudged after him, excitement lighting his face. "Go, boy! What do you see?" Duke stopped near a cluster of birch trees, the white bark gleaming under the overcast sky. His nose pressed into the snow, digging feverishly. Walter knelt beside him and brushed the surface with his gloves. Something metallic glinted beneath the ice. He cleared more snow away, revealing a rusted collar tag, half buried. Then another and another. Nora's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Beneath the frozen ground lay a shallow pit filled with remnants, collars, bones, the twisted remains of leashes. The realization settled like lead. These weren't strays. They were service dogs, the kind trained for law enforcement. Ben's voice trembled. "They were like Duke, weren't they?" Walter nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Yeah, kid. They were his brothers." Snow began to fall again, light and soundless. Nora knelt, brushing a gloved hand over one of the tags. Who would do this? Walter stared at the pit, jaw clenched. Someone who wanted them forgotten. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the wind moved, sighing through the birch trees. Then Walter removed his gloves, the cold biting at his skin as he placed his hand over the mound. His voice was low but steady. "Rest easy, boys. You've been found." Duke sat beside him, tail still, ears pricked toward the horizon. The snow swirled around them like a shroud, and for the first time in years, Walter felt something shift inside him, an old sense of duty awakening. Nora stood, her breath visible in the fading light. "What happens now?" Walter rose, his shadow long against the white field. "Now," he said quietly, "we start digging, not just here." Behind them, the lake wind carried a sound that could almost have been a howl, or perhaps a chorus of spirits relieved to be remembered. Dawn broke gray and soundless over Duluth. The storm had passed, leaving behind streets buried in silence and snow, like a city holding its breath. Walter Hayes stood in front of the courthouse steps, collar up against the cold, coffee steaming in his calloused hand. The weight of what they had found at Silver Bluff still pressed against his chest. Sleep had been scarce. Duty, however, had never needed rest. By the time he reached the police station, the morning shift was already in motion. Fluorescent lights hummed above the desks, casting everything in sterile yellow. Chief Raymond Clark stood in his office behind a glass partition, coat neatly pressed, silver hair slicked back, expression unreadable. The man had the posture of authority and the smile of someone who had learned how to weaponize charm. When he caught sight of Walter, that smile appeared immediately, well-rehearsed and hollow. "Mr. Hayes," Clark said, stepping out, his deep baritone voice carrying the practiced warmth of a politician. "I hear you've been busy stirring old ghosts." "Ghosts don't stay buried forever," Walter replied evenly, "especially when they have tags and collars." A flicker of irritation crossed Clark's face before he masked it again with civility. "Careful, Marine. It's easy to mistake loyalty for obsession. Walter didn't answer. Instead, he handed over a sealed envelope. Inside were the photographs Nora had taken on Silver Bluff. The rusted collars, the serial numbers still visible through the frost. Clark's gaze lingered on the pictures longer than necessary, his jaw tightening before he snapped the file shut. "I'll have this looked into." "I'm sure you will," Walter said dryly. Moments later, Nora arrived, still in her gray coat dusted with snow, her hair pulled back but wind-blown. "You said to bring the veterinary report," she said to Walter, ignoring Clark's presence. Her voice was calm, but her eyes, green flecked with gold, were sharp, defiant. "The fragments we found inside Duke match a Winchester 70, serial number registered under Roy Hargrove." Clark's brows lifted slightly. "That drunk?" He chuckled too quickly. "Wouldn't surprise me. He's always been trouble." Walter studied him quietly. He had seen this kind of man before, in command tents and Senate hearings. Men who smiled while their orders buried others. Later that day, a warrant was signed by Judge Elaine Porter, a woman in her late 50s, short, stocky, with sharp gray eyes and a voice that cut through hesitation, like a blade through silk. She was known around the county for her integrity and her refusal to be intimidated. "You've got cause," she told Walter, stamping the document. "But if you're going down there, go prepared. Men like Clark don't leave their messes tidy." The raid on Roy Hargrove's house began under a curtain of freezing rain. The structure was a sagging farmhouse on the outskirts of town, its roof bowed under snow, windows blacked out with plywood. Walter led the way, accompanied by Nora, 2 deputies, and Duke, now strong enough to walk, though still limping slightly. His fur had grown back unevenly, leaving pale scars like stories written across his body. They pried up the warped floorboards and uncovered a hidden trapdoor. The air that escaped from below smelled of rust and decay. Walter descended first, flashlight slicing through the darkness. What he saw turned his stomach. Rows of cages lined the walls, metal bars bent and rusted, chains still attached, bloodstains long dried. Dozens of identification tags hung from nails like trophies. Nora covered her mouth, whispering, "Dear God." Roy was found crouched in a corner, gaunt and wild-eyed, his once red flannel shirt stiff with grime. His face, unshaven and hollow, made him look older than his years. When the beam of Walter's flashlight hit him, he squinted like a rat caught in daylight. "You think you know what you're doing," Roy rasped. "You think this is about dogs?" Walter didn't answer. He noticed the shape of a rifle leaning against the wall, a Winchester Model 70. "Put your hands where I can see them," Walter ordered, stepping forward. Roy's grin twisted, teeth yellow. "You don't get it, do you? I just cleaned up. He's the one who told me to bury them." Before Walter could respond, Roy lunged for the rifle. The motion was fast, desperate. Duke growled, body tensing. The sound echoed like a warning shot. As Roy pulled the gun up, the shepherd launched forward, colliding with his chest. The rifle fired once, the shot going wild, and Roy crashed against the wall, gasping as Duke pinned him down. Walter kicked the weapon away, cuffing the man in one fluid motion. "You're under arrest," he said coldly. Later, back at the clinic, Nora extracted the deformed bullet fragment from Duke's abdomen. When the lab results came in, they confirmed the truth. The markings matched Roy's rifle exactly. That evening, the interrogation began. Roy sat in a metal chair, wrists chained to the table. His eyes darted between Walter and Clark, who had been called in as a witness. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. "You don't scare me," Roy spat. "You think this is justice? I did what I was told." "By who?" Walter pressed. Roy's grin returned, lazy and spiteful. "You already know." He turned to Clark, whose face went pale. "He said to make them disappear. Said it was cleaner that way. Local disposal authorized. That's what he called it." Clark stood abruptly. "That's a lie," he barked, but his voice cracked mid-sentence, betraying him. Walter's recorder on the table clicked softly. Every word was captured. The following week, the trial began under a gray sky heavy with snow. The courthouse was packed. Reporters, townsfolk, veterans, all drawn by the whispers of corruption. Judge Porter presided, her gavel sharp as thunder. The evidence was laid bare. The photographs, the bullet, the collars, and the audio recording in which Clark's trembling voice confessed to approving off-the-books disposal to protect the department's image. Roy Hargrove was found guilty on all counts: animal cruelty, illegal trafficking, obstruction of justice. Raymond Clark, once the most powerful man in Duluth, was convicted of misconduct and cover-up. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed like a final shot fired into the cold heart of silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and relentless, coating the courthouse steps. Walter stood on the landing, watching as Duke nudged Ben's mittened hand. The boy grinned, whispering, "From now on, I'm calling you Sir Duke." The shepherd tilted his head, the faint jingle of his new collar chiming like a small bell in the stillness. Nora laughed softly. "He seems to approve." Walter smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Maybe we all got promoted today." For the first time in months, Duluth felt lighter, as though the snow wasn't just covering the past, but cleansing it. Spring arrived slowly in Duluth, as if the land itself had forgotten how to breathe without snow. Ice cracked along the edge of Lake Superior, releasing faint whispers that drifted through the thawing wind. For the first time in months, sunlight reached the ground with gentleness instead of cruelty. Walter Hayes stood at the crest of a hill overlooking the lake, hands in his jacket pockets, studying the small wooden structure rising beneath his watchful eye. A sign, freshly carved and still smelling of pine, read, "Valor's Haven." Beneath it, smaller words curved like a quiet promise, a second home for those who fought too long to quit. The place had taken shape over weeks of hard work and sleepless nights. The cabin, once Walter's, had been rebuilt and expanded, its windows large to catch the morning light. Behind it stretched fenced fields where rescue dogs roamed freely, tails wagging in cautious hope. Near the porch stood a half-finished barn that would serve as a therapy hall for veterans and animals alike. Walter had poured everything he had into it: savings, sweat, and a belief that healing wasn't something you found, but something you built with your own hands. Duke trotted beside him, his fur fully grown again, the scars now silver streaks that caught the sun. His gait was still slightly uneven, but his spirit had grown stronger than ever. When Walter stopped to catch his breath, Duke leaned against his leg as if to remind him that even the strongest needed support sometimes. Nora Monroe emerged from the barn, wiping sawdust from her palms. Her hair was tied up under a cap, a smudge of dirt streaking one cheek. "You realize most people your age would be in Florida right now," she teased. Walter chuckled, voice low and warm. "Most people my age don't have a sergeant breathing down their neck." Duke barked once, as if agreeing. Nora smiled, but there was pride behind her humor. She had become the heart of Valor's Haven, organizing vet checkups, therapy sessions, and rescue operations. When she wasn't working, she could often be found sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, writing letters to organizations that had once forgotten men like Walter. A small figure came running down the slope. Ben Carter, his red jacket flapping like a flag in the breeze. He carried a clipboard too big for his arms and a whistle that hung crookedly from his neck. "Mr. Hayes," he shouted, stopping to catch his breath. "We got 2 new rescues from Iron Range. One's blind in the right eye, but super friendly." "Easy, soldier," Walter said, taking the clipboard. "You're gonna give yourself a heart attack before middle school." Ben grinned, freckles glowing under the spring sun. "Can I name them?" Nora laughed. "You can suggest names. Walter has veto power, remember." Walter skimmed the list Ben had scribbled. Names like Ranger, Shadow, Lucky 2, and Sir Barkalot. He snorted. "Kid, you've got creativity. I'll give you that." Behind them, a van rumbled into the gravel drive. Out stepped Caleb Moore, a tall man in his early 40s with a prosthetic leg and a quiet, measured way of moving. His hair was sandy blonde, cropped close, his eyes a pale blue that seemed to look straight through the surface of things. He wore a faded army jacket with a patch torn at the shoulder and carried a duffel bag that had seen as much weather as he had. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked softly. "That's me," Walter replied, shaking his hand. The grip was firm, familiar, the kind shared between soldiers who didn't need words to recognize pain. "Caleb served with the 2nd Battalion out of Camp Pendleton," Nora explained. "He reached out after the story broke on the local news." Caleb nodded, gaze flicking toward Duke. "Heard you were taking in veterans and dogs who've seen too much." His voice was calm, but carried a weight that came from sleepless years. "Figured I fit both categories." Walter studied him for a moment, seeing the shadow behind the man's eyes. "You looking for help? Or for a job?" Caleb gave a faint, crooked smile. "Both, if you've got room." Walter motioned to the open field. "Plenty of room. The only rule here is every soul pulls their own weight, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Caleb nodded, his gaze softening as Duke approached. The shepherd sniffed the man's prosthetic leg, then gently rested his head against it. Caleb exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time. "Guess he approves," he murmured. "Then you're hired," Walter said simply. As days passed, life began to bloom in Valor's Haven. Veterans from neighboring towns came seeking solace, some on crutches, some carrying invisible wounds. The air filled with barking, laughter, and the rhythmic sounds of rebuilding. Nora set up therapy programs pairing each veteran with a rescue dog, bonding them through trust, discipline, and shared silence. One morning, a woman in her 70s arrived unannounced. Her name was Evelyn Briggs, small and frail, but with a spark in her gaze that hadn't dimmed with age. Her hair, silver white, framed a face lined not just by time, but by endurance. She carried a faded photo, 2 young Marines smiling beside a K9 in desert sands. Walter's breath caught as he took the photo. That's my unit." Evelyn nodded, her voice trembling. "I'm Sam Briggs's mother." He froze. Sam Briggs, his old partner, the one he'd left behind in Fallujah. "I heard what you built here," she continued. "My boy would have liked that. He used to say, if he ever made it home, he'd open a place for dogs who didn't belong anywhere." Walter's throat tightened. "He did make it home, ma'am. Maybe not to a house, but to this." He gestured toward the field, the kennels, the laughter. "Every nail in that barn, he's part of it." Evelyn smiled through tears. "Then I can rest easier knowing that." She reached down to pat Duke's head. You take care of this old Marine for me, all right? Duke wagged his tail solemnly, as though promising. That night, Walter sat on the porch overlooking the lake. The stars shimmered like scattered metals across the black water. Nora joined him, 2 mugs of cocoa steaming between them. You did it, she said softly. You turned loss into something that saves others. Walter looked out toward the kennel where Duke slept beside the new arrivals. Maybe saving others is how we finally save ourselves. She smiled, resting a hand on his. You think you'll ever stop fighting? He chuckled. Only if the world stops needing fighters. From the barn came the sound of laughter. Ben teaching Caleb how to throw a ball for the dogs. Walter listened, the warmth of it spreading through the chill. The snow was gone now, replaced by soft, green grass pushing through the earth. Proof that even the hardest ground could heal. When the last snow melted over Duluth, and the grass began to grow again around Valor's Haven, Walter realized that miracles don't always arrive with thunder or shining light. Sometimes they come quietly, on 4 legs, with a scarred heart and loyal eyes that remind us what grace truly means. In a world that often forgets its wounded, a single act of compassion can be a prayer answered. Walter once thought God had gone silent after the war, but through Duke's steady gaze, through Nora's faith, through the laughter of a boy and the courage of broken men, he discovered that heaven still whispers, only softer now, asking us to listen. So tonight, if this story touched something inside you, share it. Tell someone about the power of kindness, about second chances, about the small miracles that walk among us disguised as stray dogs or tired souls. Leave a comment to honor the unseen heroes in your life, human or animal, who never stopped believing in love. And if you believe, as Walter does now, that every new day is proof that God hasn't forgotten us, then subscribe to the channel so we can keep spreading these stories of hope. May the Lord bless you, guide your path, and remind you that even in the coldest winter, faith, like spring, always returns.